Hi, good morning. Today we're going to be looking at the steps of photosynthesis. So we're going to be looking at two specific steps. We're also going to be working on completing the virtual photosynthesis lab from yesterday and starting a wrap-up photosynthesis computer activity, more of like a web quest. Okay, so that's the goals for today. So I'm going to be covering the notes for the types of photosynthesis, and then you guys will be completing the virtual photosynthesis lab that you started yesterday and starting to work on the photosynthesis computer activity. Okay, so there's really going to be looking at two types of photosynthesis. And the key points to pay attention to when we're looking at this is the first is what are the reactants and the products of each step. There's two steps. There's a light reaction and there's a light independent reaction. So we're going to look at what the reactants are for each of those and what are the products for each of those, and also look at where these things take place at. Okay. So like I said, mentioned just a second ago, the two steps are light dependent reaction and then also the light independent reaction. We also call that the Calvin cycle, and sometimes it's called the dark cycle. So when we look at those two, all right, so we're going to look at the light dependent reaction first. And this is the first step of photosynthesis. And being light dependent, it requires light. Okay, so this takes place in the thylakoids. And if you remember that from the structure of chloroplast or chloroplast, that the thylakoids are the little discs, the little pancakes. So it takes place in those, and this is light dependent, so it requires energy. So sunlight and water come into the grana as reactants. So sunlight and water are the reactants, okay? The product of this is oxygen. And ATP stores energy, and those carrier molecules carry the energy to the Calvin cycle or to the light independent reaction, okay? So here's a little diagram. See sunlight coming in, water comes in, the reaction happens here in the thylakoid, and then it sends out oxygen as like a byproduct. But during this, the ATP is getting carried over to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle needs the energy because it does not have light. Okay, so it needs the energy, and the NADPH is carrying it over there. Okay, so we're looking at that. Next, we're looking at the light independent reaction. And this is also called the Calvin cycle. Sometimes it's called the dark cycle. I grew up knowing it as the Calvin cycle, but I think more the terminology we use nowadays on like EOCs and milestones is the light independent reaction. Okay, so like as I mentioned, this one does not require energy, but it requires the ATP. So it needs the ATP instead of the light to get it started. All right, this takes place in the stroma. Remember, the stroma is like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. So it takes place outside of the chlorophyll-filled sacs. It takes place out in the stroma. Okay, so the reactant here is carbon dioxide. All right. And when this interacts and goes through all the processes, this is what produces the glucose. And the glucose is what the plant needs and what it makes out of the whole process of photosynthesis. All right? So no light's required. It takes place out in the stroma. Carbon dioxide is the reactant, and the product is glucose. All right? And when this happens, ADP releases energy, and the carrier protein takes it back to the light-dependent step. So we're going to look at the diagram again. So remember over here, sunlight happens, and water comes in, and like a byproduct of oxygen. The plant does not need oxygen, so it sends it out, and then we get to breathe it in, thank goodness. All right, ATP gets carried over here because this Calvin cycle does not have light, so it needs energy, and it goes through over here. So carbon dioxide, which comes in, goes through the process, and glucose is the product. The plant keeps the glucose. It needs the glucose. All right, so the ATP comes over here. Remember, it loses a phosphate, gives it some energy. When it all the said and done, the ADP comes back over here, and see that phosphate just floating around out there. Gets carried back over and turns back into ATP. But that's regardless. So what we need to know, okay, so the light dependent reactions happen in the thylakoids. And that's, remember, one of those is a thylakoid, a stack is a grana. So it takes place in here using the chlorophyll. Right? So it needs the sunlight, and water comes in, and it just releases oxygen out into the atmosphere. ATP is carried over here because there's no light. Carbon dioxide is what drives this one. Carbon dioxide is the reactant, goes through the Calvin cycle, and it makes glucose. So it keeps that glucose. So that's the things we need to know. So this takes place in the thylakoids. Water is the reactant. Oxygen is the product. This takes place out in the stroma. Carbon dioxide is the reactant, and glucose is the product. I hope that explains the two steps of photosynthesis. If you have any questions, please email me or ask me. Hope you guys have a great day and work on the virtual photosynthesis lab when you're comparing the different colors of light, and then move on to the photosynthesis computer activity. Hope to hear from you guys soon.